First of all, thank you, Elad, for the invitation, and Mick and the whole BIV team for organizing this event and giving me the opportunity to stand in front of you today. Cool, so today I want to tell you about Molecule Protocol. Molecule is a protocol for the open development of molecular structures. So we're talking about chemical engineering, bioengineering, biotech, and pharma, and we are talking about technological convergence. So I'm just going to give a brief overview. So Molecule Protocol is an open platform that enables the distributed research and development of chemical structures and compounds. It's a market-making software in its essence that enables price discovery, funding, and curation of pharmaceutical IP. The core design goal of Molecule is to distribute the cost, the risk, and the ownership of drugs and compounds. In its design, it's really think of it as an ecosystem and an operating model, or an operating system that aims to align stakeholder interest. And the stakeholders in the pharmaceutical industry are very wide. We're talking about the consumers of medication, the regulator who approves that medication. You're talking about the big pharma companies, you're talking about biotech companies, you're talking about academia, you're talking about the lawyers that create the patents. So it's a very big and complex ecosystem. We're developing this project as a Swiss-based nonprofit foundation that aims to create an even level playing field for all of these stakeholders. We've realized, specifically working in this field for a while, that the pharmaceutical industry is an industry with an extremely low amount of trust between the participants. It's very monopolistic and very competitive. So how do you create this kind of even playing field for everyone? Let's actually start with the problems, though, because it's fascinating. So pharmaceutical development today is expensive. It costs about $2.5 billion on average to take a drug to market. It's very slow. It takes 2.3 years to bring a drug to market. And then it's extremely risky. So 0.012% is the average drug success for commercialization. And then fundamentally, pharma is in an innovation and in a trust crisis. So R&D today is closed source and intransparent. Negative data never sees the light of day. It's monopolistic and non-collaborative, which, if you think about science, seems totally backwards. So there's all of these big pharma companies or small biotech companies researching in absolute secrecy about information that, if it were publicly available, that research could potentially be much faster. So there's another problem in science, more generally called the reproducibility crisis, where negative data is never published, and since only positive data is published, but it's very difficult to reproduce those positive results because you don't see the back of the negative data. And then fundamentally, pharmaceutical development today is revenue-driven innovation that in a way also controls what can actually come to market. So if you think about these really big numbers, only very big players can afford to take on that risk and to invest that money. And they will most likely only invest in compounds and medication that will support their bottom line, so that is highly profitable. And as a result of these different practices, public trust today in the pharmaceutical industry is lower than the weapons industry in the United States. So think about that. The public trusts pharma less than the weapons industry, which is really mind-boggling if you think about an industry that should serve public health and the public good. Combined, though, it makes it one of the biggest industries on the planet, just about $1.5 trillion in yearly revenue from pharmaceuticals. And so what is the key value driver in pharma? That's kind of how we started out thinking about this. And fundamentally, it's having a monopoly on intellectual property, generally in the form of patents. So patents are generally held and exploited by single entities in a very high friction environment. So what patents essentially are is, if you think about them commercially, they are a negative right. They are a right to sue anyone that engages with something that you've patented. And for this reason, most of the time, it's one organization that will shoulder all of those high costs and all of the risk. And what are the consequences of this market behavior and this market structure? So pharma R&D traditionally used to be very high risk. It used to be pioneering. It used to be at the cusp of innovation. And actually, if you think about pharma innovation, that has kind of stayed that way. Like we've decoded most of the human genome Today we're using AI and machine learning for drug discovery, but despite that, investments in R&D are going down, specifically because they are so risky. And today, pharma R&D is a very low risk, so there's low risk taking and very high ticket sizes in order to actually fund any particular development. What also happens is within a company, a pharma company will often patent a lot of different compounds, removing them from the market so no one can research them, but then never do anything with them. And this has to do with capital allocation priorities, because there's only so much money you can spend within a pharma company to develop certain assets, but the rest you've still patented so no one can touch them. And again, this is a huge hindrance to innovation and ties up potentially productive capital. And furthermore, these monopolies mean that there's no incentives for opening up research data and for collaboration. So essentially, if let's assume you're a researcher at a university and you find a new compound that could, you find a compound group that could potentially be a good target to treat a certain type of cancer. You then research more about this compound group and you realize, oh, it's all been patented by Roche, for example. That means you can't touch any of it and you can't research it. So even if you had even if you had interest to research it, unless you engage into a commercial relationship or into an academic relationship with Roche, which then means everything is under NDA, you can't touch any of it. If you think it's just very backwards. So this is a quote from J.P. Garnier. He was the former CEO of GlaxoSmithKline. He resigned in 2008, was with the organization for 60 years, and if you dig deeper into pharma, you will see, just Google innovation crisis in pharma, and you'll find 3 to 4 pages on Google that just, with different authors listing as pharma. And so he says the way to solve the productivity problem is to return power to the scientists by reorganizing R&D into small, highly focused groups, headed by people who are leaders in their scientific fields and can guide and inspire their teams to achieve greatness. It is to seek the best science wherever it resides, inside or outside a company. It is to fix broken processes and promote a strong culture of innovation, marked by a passion for excellence and an awareness that results matter. The basic philosophy for modern R&D should be to morph big into small, in recognition of the fact that critical mass in fundamental research is the size of one human brain. I like this last part, the size of one human brain, because it kind of takes us back to this notion of a node in a network. A network is always as strong as the weakest node. So the CEOs of these companies are realizing, hey, our innovation model is broken, and these big giant corporations are actually very hard to drive innovation with. So we have 2 new technological trends that we believe that can solve these issues, and one of them is open innovation. So there's an initiative called Open Pharma, which is researching new ways to find unpatented solutions to malaria and mycetoma. So both tropical diseases that traditional pharma companies are not interested in delivering solutions for, because they don't feed the bottom line. So that's one model, is why not do scientific innovation out in the open? But the problem is, how do you incentivize open innovation? Open innovation basically means moving away from this closed source data creation and business model into an economic system where open innovation is rewarded. And that's the second trend, is that blockchain-powered networks can enable new financing, ownership, and collaboration models where open innovation can actually thrive. And so when we started out looking at building this protocol, mechanism design is really crucial if you want to build a bigger ecosystem. So this is kind of mapping out the key stakeholders that exist in pharma today, which are the IP creators. And IP creators can be a university creating a new intellectual property and then patenting it. It can be a biotech or a pharma company. Then the data producers. Data producers can be clinical trials companies, anyone who basically produces data about a certain compound. And you'll see there's a lot of overlap with these stakeholders, but they all want different things. We then have the regulators and the verifiers who make sure that the data that was produced correctly and shows that this compound, which is the IP, is effectively safe to consume. Then we have the consumers who fundamentally want to take new medication that may help them. We have the manufacturers who only need to get the approval from the regulator that the IP is safe and will then license the IP to create it. And finally, we have the investors who want to make money off the IP they invested in via the consumers. So you kind of start realizing it's just a cycle that ends with the consumer consuming a safe medicine and starts with someone creating IP. And so now we ask ourselves, what do all of these people actually want? What behavior should they have in an ideal world? And how can we change that behavior with incentive design? And incentive design really came up in the blockchain ecosystem over the past 2 years, a lot of it under this notion of token engineering. And Elad earlier said it spoke in a very good way about it. It's how can we get people to behave in a certain way? How do we get them to act differently? And it's an engineering practice because often this practice consists of first of all, software engineering practices, but also crypto economics and mechanism design as a practice in itself. So one aspect of token engineering, one design mechanism is a concept called curation markets. So curation markets, this is a quote from Sam de la Rubia, one of the founding fathers of this discipline. Curation markets reduce information asymmetry in the market through the usage of novel skin in the game signals generated through the use of tokenized crypto economic incentive games. It's actually much easier than that quote, but that quote sums it together very nicely. Essentially, market participants will put their money where their mouth is. And if you know, Nicholas Taleb wrote a recent book, I think it came out about a year ago, called Skin in the Game, and how skin in the game essentially changes a lot of behavior in economics. So with curation markets, what people do is they stake value, normally in the form of attention, or attention in the form of value, into markets they believe will be more valuable. And the market's currency is a proxy for attention, which rewards early adopters. Two good examples of this that are commonly known are token curated registries, and the other one, token bonding curves. Don't confuse the two. Often many people think of curation markets as TCRs, but they're not. TCRs are lists, and bonding curves are essentially market makers. We're going to look at the second one more closely because it brings us to what we want to do. So why are curation markets very cool if we start thinking about pharma? So this is the typical pharmaceutical development cycle. You move from drug discovery into preclinical phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then approval. Typically, the amount of investment here is highest, so in these 3 phases, whereas here you're dealing with thousands of potential compounds and potential targets. And these 2 bottom pictures are traditional innovation management pictures that you'd see in any MBA. It's essentially a company will look at many different research projects and ideas, and then kind of build a funnel to take one of them to market. This is a very similar concept, but now think of all of these dots essentially being compounds or molecular structures, and now imagine each company has to go through this process by themselves, and they patent everything along here, even though it might not be successful, and they need to make all of the investments themselves. So, using curation markets in this concept, in this industry, could be really interesting. And so what are token bonding curves? So Elad asked me to do a basic intro to them, so you guys can take something useful. It's essentially a smart contract that it's actually very simple. It's a smart contract that accepts collateral, so US dollars, or any digital assets in exchange for tokens of its denomination. So the contract takes in money and gives out tokens. It holds that collateral in a reserve, so it doesn't give that money out again unless you give it tokens back. Users can freely trade and engage with the contract and thus enable price discovery for the underlying asset. The price, dollars to the token, is determined by a function. And it's really important that no one gets the bond, or so it's not an offering in any sense. It's really a price discovery mechanism. So how does this look? In the most basic function, the price per token, the y-axis, is bonded to a number of tokens in circulation in the x-axis, and predefined by a slope formula. So this is just a mathematical function. In this case, it's an exponential function. You can use any type of function. We'll briefly look at a sigmoid function just now. And so what happens is essentially, let's assume this kind of market represents an underlying asset, for example, a molecular structure in the form of a patent. And now users can freely trade up and down this curve. Early users are rewarded, and we can see the attention that participants stake into a specific market. Cool, big second trend, non-fungibles. How many of you know what a CryptoKitty is? Assuming most. Okay. Most people? If not, so CryptoKitties kind of went viral in, I think, mid 2017 or early 2018. It's essentially trading digital cats on the blockchain in the form of non-fungible tokens. Non-fungible means the token is not divisible, whereas any other token is divisible. So it's a nice token to represent unique ownership in a specific asset. So huge trend here. People are using this for all kinds of stuff, for gaming, for licenses. There's a lot of different ways to play with it. But now imagine we make these non-fungible tokens fungible again. So IP is usually based on patents and proprietary timestamp data. What now if you take that information, the data in a patent, and you attach it to an NFT? So we combine those two elements, and now essentially with a very simple mechanism, we have a patent on a blockchain. But now we combine those two again. We set the ERC20 bonded curve token as the owner address of the ERC 721. So our token bonding smart contract now owns this digital cat, or it could be a patent for a fusion reactor or a molecule. On the blockchain, nobody knows if you're a cat or a fusion reactor. It's essentially just addresses, just strings of number. But yeah, so we've combined those two things, and now what happens is we essentially have patents that, or intellectual property that can own itself, and that can incentivize its creation in the world. So just on a conceptual perspective, this is similar to some of the thinking that Ocean has around Nature 2.0. It's like Molecules 2.0. You can have self-owning IP by virtue of the patent owner essentially relinquishing ownership in their patent, and in return receiving a certain amount of tokens out of a market. So they now a single organization doesn't have to own all of that IP anymore. What it also means, it doesn't have to shoulder all of the costs anymore of its development. What could mapping innovation in pharma look like? So bear in mind, this is a really oversimplified kind of graphical representation of what a bonding curve for pharmaceutical development could look like. But imagine this is a function that ends at a certain point. It's a sigmoid function, which is normally used for population growth. And in this case, you kind of imagine in this early stage, maybe a compound never reaches this drug discovery stage, and most compounds never do because they're not suitable. But now essentially imagine this asset being traded in an open market where capital can freely be contributed, and people can freely contribute research data about a specific compound. So as the total growth, sort of the total capital that is allocated to the asset grows, more attention is staked into the compound. And at this stage, it could be decided that this drug actually isn't suitable, and all of the capital that has been contributed up until there can go out of the market again and flow into a different market. So consider that we've moved on from this model quite a bit since then, but this is a very simple conceptual representation of what market behavior in this sense could look like. So maybe coming back to what we're doing, what this is fundamentally about is really about frictionless public markets and rights in an industry where it was previously very, very hard to do something like this. What I mean with frictionless public markets, it means essentially you can do IP securitization and collective funding models and ownership models with much, much, much less friction than you would have done before. So a good question commonly is like, why hasn't IP securitization happened before on a larger scale? It's because traditionally you always need an underwriter for any securities offering. And an underwriter typically takes on the risk if the offering doesn't go through. And an offering also needs, you need market making functions, you need a prospectus, so on and so forth. So in this case, what we're doing now is the underwriter is the bonding curve, and the bonding curve essentially takes on the risk of the offering not going through. Essentially what the bonding curve does is it allows market participants to freely trade in and out of the curve by making the market. So you don't need, and the bonding curve is always buying and always selling, depending on what price point we're at. And we can bootstrap a market by staking in the value of the patent without needing prior liquidity. What this means, for example, in this case is like, imagine the creator of this curve stakes in, let's say it's a biotech company, they stake in the first amount, valuing their patent at $500,000, and they create the market, and that's where the market starts, because they've staked in the value of their patent. And so fundamentally, like, what are the key results that comes out of this? So what we're creating are essentially low-friction innovation markets for all involved stakeholders. What this means is the market operation and use of costs are much lower than they have been before. Or it's essentially creating markets that never existed, and creating new asset classes with it. We create incentives for open innovation, reducing R&D costs and democratizing value, and we're creating open source legal frameworks for this actually to make sense at scale. And open source legal frameworks in the sense of, I should be able to take an existing patent that I have and very easily move it onto a market structure like this. Let's say I'm sitting on 3 to 4 patents that I valued at 200,000 to 300,000. And with patents, especially chemical patents, it's normally a chicken and an egg problem. Namely, you need capital in order to prove that the compound has any value. But in order to get capital, you need to prove that the compound is valuable. And what you can do with this is you can let an open market decide what is valuable and what isn't. And you also give and incentivize, you give a research right and an incentivization right to anyone who buys in. So let's say I find a patent on our platform, and I see that this is for an interesting compound that I've been researching myself as a researcher. Previously, I wouldn't have had the right to research this compound. With Molecule, I can buy a stake, for example, let's say worth $1,000. I can run a 3 to 6 month in silico trial if this compound could be used in a certain setting. And not only now do I have the right to do and publish about my research, I also have a baked-in incentive. Because if my research is positive, then other market participants will see that this compound is undervalued and more attention flows into a compound. So now I've created incentives for opening up data. So fundamentally, IP is curated in an open market via positive and negative data. It also solves the negative data problem, because this effectively enables people to short compounds. So previously, there was never an incentive to publish negative data. Why, if I'm researching a specific new medication, why would I publish that all of my trials are going not well? So negative data is commonly held back. And so with this, if I find negative data about a compound, I can bet against the market as well. And it's good for the market to have that data, because maybe capital in it was misallocated. Risk, cost, and reward are shared among different participants, which will allow much higher risk investments to happen again. Yeah, and then I've talked about standardized legal agreements. Cool, so where do we see the future of pharma going? Elad asked me a little bit to talk about the future and where we see this fitting in fundamentally. So already today we can see that society is decentralizing many aspects of pharma. I wouldn't be surprised if in a few years Facebook could give me a more accurate description of what medication I need than my doctor. In many cases, like I think personal medicine is very important, but just from the amount of data collection, the daily movements that a person makes about their habits, and it's kind of scary as well. So what is really interesting in our case is technology convergence and building a platform that will enable technology convergence. So already today, we're using AI, machine learning, research, and drug discovery. There's many biotech companies that have popped up over the past few years that are using ML to scan vast compound libraries, and based on that, so let's say molecular data about millions and millions of compounds, and identifying new targets through that. Another really cool trend is 3D printing in pharma. So you can actually decentralize production to a certain degree. By having 3D printed drugs. It's not 3D printing in the traditional sense, it's more like, think of micro sort of chemical production. But that's another big trend that has been working for the past 10 years. Health records and big data are increasingly being opened up, and that will give access to personalized medicine. And then the last one, which I also think is really interesting, the possibility to do distributed clinical trials via personal monitoring devices. So the Apple Watch, things like that will only increase. So if we can put a personal monitoring device on someone who's willing to contribute to a study, then that can be a huge advancement. So what's missing here? The underlying financial infrastructure is missing. And that's essentially a big part of what we're building, an infrastructure that will that creates economic incentives for people to collaborate and stakeholders to collaborate in a very different manner. And we see that sort of all of these trends will converge in a sort of in a new path to how drugs and medicine are developed. Cool. Last slide, almost done. Cool. Where are we going next? Kind of where we are. So Molecule is a very ambitious undertaking. It tackles an entire industry. It tackles one of the most challenging industries on the planet. We're still in an early stage, but we believe this can really change pharma in very, very significant ways moving forward. It's been in development since December 2017 by Linum Labs AG, which is a Swiss development company. We've received about $1 million in seed funding. The public launch of the Swiss Foundation is aimed in January 2019. We're currently lining up industry collaborations, think tanks, and academic collaborations. The foundation will fund the development via a network token that provides participation, security, and access to the protocol for these big stakeholders to collaborate. And it's supported by local authorities and in approval with the Swiss regulator. Yeah, we believe that this protocol can really change the way that scientific advancement will happen in pharma in really significant ways. And also cast science in general and pharma as a whole in a very positive light again, which is really, really our mission here. Cool. Thank you, everyone.
So we're running a little bit behind, but I think it would be a shame to not take any questions. Sure. Let's do maybe a quick question or two.
What would be the trade-offs of using bonding curves versus hardware taxes for tradable IP?
Really good question. So hard budget taxes. So with bonding curves, you have a direct ownership model that's where someone who's contributed to the curve now owns a part of that asset. With hard budget tax, the asset would still sit in a monopoly in essence with one stakeholder. What we've been thinking about is combining bonding curves and hard budget taxes, but then you're combining two still very new theoretical concepts. But I think there's really interesting applications with hard budget taxes around intellectual property, specifically because it drives the market to just allocate resources in a much more efficient way. One additional complexity that I could see is that most IP is unactivated on balance sheets. So this would force companies to evaluate their own IP, which they commonly can't do. So there's an accounting problem there on top of that. Something that, one last comment just on that note is, we think that this model is highly attractive actually to many pharma companies because they sit on so much IP that they know they're never going to use. And so if you give them the chance to offload IP, not only is that an additional revenue stream for them, they can now also book it on their balance sheet, which is good for their stock price. But yeah, I really like hard budget taxes, so thanks for your question.